Today's material is a study abstract summarizing a massive 24-month cluster randomized trial in Singapore, demonstrating how releasing Wolbachia-infected male mosquitoes successfully suppressed wild-type populations and reduced dengue virus infections. And while this data is undeniably rigorous, we must immediately pivot to how the presentation of that data can be optimized for maximum impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the underlying science here is just an incredible achievement. The whole mechanism of using those Wolbachia-infected males to induce cytoplasmic incompatibility,
Right?
which effectively crashes the wild mosquito population across these huge urban sectors, it's fascinating. But having a monumental data set is really only half the battle.
Oh, for sure. The other half is actually guiding the reader through it.
Exactly. And scientific writers, they often feel this profound compulsion to act as chroniclers. Like, they want to list every single mathematical reality with equal weight.
Yeah, they want to show all their work.
But an abstract requires the author to be a ruthless editor. You have to decide what matters most. And right now, the text is, it's asking the reader to parse way too much simultaneously.
Streamlining the presentation of statistical outcomes will significantly strengthen the impact of the primary findings. Let's look closely at the section discussing the endpoint results.
Right, the numbers.
Yeah. Within essentially a single highly compressed sentence, the text presents three entirely different mathematical frameworks. First, it gives us the intention to treat test percentages, noting 6% versus 21%. Then, it immediately introduces the protective efficacy percentages, noting a range of 71 to 72%. And then, finally, without any structural break at all, it concludes with the odds ratios, stating they are 0.28 to 0.29.
The fundamental weakness here is that all of these metrics are competing for the exact same narrative real estate.
Yes.
Because the text doesn't prioritize one metric over the others, the core takeaway gets completely bogged down in this dense, competing numerical thicket.
It's just a wall of numbers.
It really is, and it creates a tremendous amount of cognitive friction. Like, protective efficacy is a highly intuitive concept, right? It's a straightforward percentage of success.
71%! Boom! Easy to understand.
Exactly. An odds ratio, however, is a measure of association between an exposure and an outcome. It fundamentally forces the reader's brain to stop reading and start calculating probability compared to a baseline.
Right. It's a completely different mental process.
You are basically asking them to do complex mental math right in the middle of your climax.
Giving someone the odds ratio alongside the efficacy percentage as equals is like, it's like handing someone the GPS coordinates of a restaurant and the street address at the exact same time.
That is a great way to put it.
Both are perfectly accurate, and both point to the exact same destination. But the GPS coordinates require the user to do translating work in their head. The momentum of the success story is completely interrupted.
Yeah, they have to stop driving to look at a map.
But, let's look at it from the author's perspective. If I'm the author, I spent 2 years gathering this data across huge geographic clusters. I want all my math up front to prove I did the work.
Sure, that makes sense.
So by combining the complex test negative control methodology with the raw text counts in the exact same breath, is there a risk we are actually diluting the perceived success of the intervention? If I subordinate the odds ratio, aren't I risking looking like I'm hiding the rigorous statistics behind a flashy top-line percentage?
Well, it is a really common fear, right? But subordination is not the same thing as omission. You maintain the absolute highest standard of scientific rigor without sacrificing the narrative velocity of the text.
Okay, so how do we fix it?
The suggestion here is to establish a clear hierarchy of metrics. Lead with the most universally impactful, big-picture figure to serve as the narrative anchor.
The headline, essentially.
Exactly. Then, deliberately subordinate the supporting statistical frameworks so they validate rather than compete with that main point. You build a cascading argument where each number serves a specific psychological purpose for the reader.
I want to look at concrete examples of how we actually construct that hierarchy on the page.
Let's do it.
If we are rewriting this results section, we take that 71 to 72% protective efficacy and we pull it to the absolute front of the clause.
Make it the star.
Right. We frame it as the definitive headline. The sentence should explicitly lead with, quote, The intervention demonstrated a protective efficacy of 71 to 72% against dengue infection.
That immediately plants the flag. You give the reader the bottom line first. But addressing your earlier point about proving the work, you then follow up immediately with the intention to treat raw counts.
To back up the percentage?
Yeah, you state that 354 out of 5,722 tests were positive in the intervention group, compared to 1,519 out of 7,080 in the control group.
That grounds a 71% efficacy in massive real-world volume. It shows the reader that this isn't, some small sample size anomaly cooked up in a lab.
No, not at all.
It is a sprawling population-level shift. The reader sees the efficacy and then immediately sees the sheer weight of the thousands of tests that generated it.
And then we handle the odds ratios. The text currently forces the reader to parse, as represented by odds ratios of 0.28 to 0.29, as an active part of the primary narrative flow.
Which we established is the cognitive speed bump.
Right. So instead, simply relegate those figures to a parenthetical inclusion at the very end of the statement. Just a simple open parentheses, OR 0.28-0.29, close parentheses.
The difference in the readability is night and day. By shifting the odds ratio to a parenthesis, you offer the statistical nuance to the peer reviewer who actively wants to verify the association.
They still get their math.
Yeah, but you allow the broader clinical audience to read straight through the sentence without hitting that mathematical speed bump.
You transform a wall of numbers into a curated tour of your success. The reader understands the victory, sees the proof of the volume, and has access to the rigorous association metric, all without ever breaking their reading stride.
Okay, so we've organized the numbers to reduce that cognitive friction. The reader is moving swiftly through the results, but clarity is really only the first hurdle.
Oh, definitely.
Once the statistical hierarchy is optimized and the reader can actually see the forest for the trees, any anomalies in that data become glaringly obvious. The text has to anticipate the skepticism that clarity inevitably invites.
Yeah, because when your data is easy to read, your vulnerabilities are also easier to spot. And there is a very specific data point in the methodology section that stands out the moment you stop struggling to parse the odds ratios.
Addressing the significant fluctuation in the control group's data will fortify the study's overall reliability and preempt skeptical reading. Let's look at the raw data provided for the mosquito populations themselves. The baseline numbers?
Right. The text notes that the baseline average mosquito abundance in the control clusters was 0.19, but then it casually states that the abundance averaged 0.277 for the remainder of the 24-month trial.
That is nearly a 50% increase in the control group's mosquito population.
It's massive.
And the critical weakness here is that this massive spike is left entirely unexplained in the abstract. Peer reviewers and seasoned scientific readers are constantly hunting for confounding variables.
Always.
Without context, a critical reader might look at that 50% jump in the control group and assume the Wolbachia intervention only looked mathematically successful because the control areas experienced an unrelated, massive surge in wild mosquitoes.
It is like testing a revolutionary new braking system on a car, claiming a 70% improvement in stopping distance, but completely failing to mention that the control car was driving on a track covered in black ice.
Exactly. You're hiding the actual conditions.
If you leave out the environmental condition, the success just looks like a fluke of the testing environment. The reader's imagination is going to fill in the blanks, and, it is rarely going to be in the author's favor.
Oh, they'll assume the worst.
They might assume methodological failure, poor trap placement in the control zones, or some localized outbreak. If we don't explain that 0.277 spike, aren't we leaving the door wide open for a reader to dismiss the 71% efficacy as a byproduct of a bad mosquito season in the control zones?
We are leaving the door wide open. The suggestion is straightforward but vital to the integrity of the piece. You need to add a brief contextual anchor regarding the temporal, environmental, or seasonal factors that affected the control clusters over the 24-month period to explain that baseline shift.
But look, abstracts have brutal word counts. Sometimes researchers are fighting a strict 250-word limit. Are we really suggesting burning precious real estate to talk about the weather and seasonal mosquito mating habits just to appease a hypothetical skeptical reviewer?
It doesn't require burning real estate. It requires surgical phrasing.
Okay, surgical. I like that.
You do not need a paragraph explaining monsoon season in Singapore. You need a single, deliberate adjective or dependent clause inserted directly into the results section that acknowledges the reality of the ecosystem.
Let's look at a concrete example of how to execute that. Instead of just listing the numbers in a vacuum, you could revise the sentence to say, quote, while control clusters experienced a likely seasonal increase in average abundance from 0.19 to 0.27, the intervention clusters demonstrated. And then you go into the results.
The inclusion of the word seasonal does a tremendous amount of heavy lifting there.
It really does.
It immediately signals to the reader, yes, we observe the 50% spike. We expected it because it is a normal environmental occurrence in this region, and crucially, our intervention worked anyway. You secure the perimeter of your data by demonstrating total awareness of the variables.
There's actually an even more assertive posture the authors could take here.
Oh?
They could add a brief clause acknowledging that the intervention proved robust specifically because it faced this environmental trend.
Okay, leaning into it?
Yeah, something along the lines of, quote, despite an overarching regional trend of rising mosquito populations, as seen in the control group's increase to 0.277, the intervention cluster successfully suppressed.
That reframing is brilliant. It takes what looks like a potential methodological vulnerability and transforms it into a demonstration of the intervention's overwhelming strength.
It becomes a flex.
Exactly. It tells the scientific community that the Wolbachia-infected mosquitoes didn't just suppress the population in a sterile, static vacuum. They actively fought back against a rising tide of wild-type mosquitoes and still achieved a 72% efficacy.
You anticipate the skepticism, you acknowledge the environmental reality, and you use it to make your efficacy number look even more impressive. You guide the reader from doubting the control group to being completely awed by the intervention's resilience.
It's a much stronger narrative position.
So we've structured the numbers so they are immediately comprehensible. We've contextualized the anomalies so the data is inherently trustworthy. But clarity and trust don't fully serve the ultimate purpose of the paper if the reader doesn't understand the real-world magnitude of what they're looking at.
Right. The architecture of an abstract is fascinating because it relies heavily on the U-shaped attention curve.
The U-shape, yeah.
Readers read the very first sentence to understand the premise, they skim the middle data, and they read the final sentence to decide if the paper matters to the broader world. The conclusion is basically the lingering flavor of the entire piece.
Expanding the concluding statement to reflect the specific demographic and methodological scale of the trial will deliver a much stronger final impression. Let's look at the current conclusion as it stands in the text.
Okay.
It reads, quote, release of sterile Wolbachia-infected male A. aegypti mosquitoes reduced vector populations and the risk of dengue infection in Singapore.
The weakness here is glaring, especially given everything we just discussed about the sheer volume of the data.
It's so short.
The conclusion is incredibly brief and entirely generic. It essentially reads like an alternative title. It completely undersells the massive scale of the accomplishment.
I know scientific abstracts highly value brevity. There is a long-standing culture in scientific writing of stark, almost clinical understatement.
True.
But is there a point where being too brief actually harms the perceived authority of the work? Does a scientist really need to remind the reader of how big the trial was if it's already in the methods section?
Humility is absolutely a virtue in science, but underselling your sample size is a disservice to the data itself. A trial involving 700 people is fundamentally different science than a trial involving 700,000 people.
Oh, completely different league.
It represents a totally different tier of logistical execution, statistical power, and real-world applicability. If the conclusion strips away all of that monumental scale and simply offers a binary "it worked" statement, the authors are leaving an immense amount of scientific authority on the table.
It is like finishing an exhausting, grueling marathon, crossing the finish line, and when someone asks you what you just did, you simply say, I ran.
Yeah.
You aren't being overly promotional by stating you ran 26 miles. You are being factually accurate about the scale of the endeavor. Doesn't the reader need to be reminded of how far they just ran right at the moment they are forming their final judgment of the work?
They absolutely do.
The suggestion here is to integrate the sheer scale of the population and the specific efficacy rate directly into the concluding takeaway. This solidifies the real-world magnitude and the scalability of the findings.
Bring the big numbers back for the finale.
Exactly. The reader shouldn't have to scroll back up to the methodology section to remember why this paper is important.
Let's construct some concrete examples for this final section. We need to move away from generic summary. A revised conclusion could explicitly state the scale right out of the date.
How would that sound?
Something like, quote, in a cluster randomized trial across populations exceeding 700,000 residents, the deployment of Wolbachia-infected male mosquitoes achieved a 71 to 72% protective efficacy against dengue infection.
The tenor of the sentence completely changes. It immediately communicates that this was a sprawling, city-state level intervention. It guarantees the clinical relevance of the work.
It feels weighty.
And to truly maximize the impact, the conclusion should also project outward. What does a 700,000-person trial mean for the rest of the world?
We could append a forward-looking phrase to the end of that sentence, such as, quote, proving highly viable for large-scale, citywide urban dengue suppression.
By combining the massive population scale with a high efficacy rate and an assertion of future applicability, the conclusion finally matches the gravity of the 24-month trial.
It elevates the whole paper.
It transitions the text from a simple historical report of an experiment that occurred in Singapore into a definitive, authoritative statement about the future of global public health strategies.
It delivers the final, undeniable proof of impact that the data inherently deserves. Let's briefly recap the core structural insights we've explored today. First, we identified the need to establish a clear hierarchy for the statistical metrics.
Right, pulling the best stats forward.
By uncoupling the odds ratios from the efficacy percentages, we eliminate cognitive friction and allow the primary success of the trial to shine.
Second, we address the crucial need for contextual anchors. By explicitly identifying the 50% surge in the control group's mosquito population as a seasonal or regional trend, we preempt the natural skepticism of peer reviewers.
Yeah, we transform a potential vulnerability into a testament to the intervention's hardiness. And finally, we looked at injecting the massive 700,000-plus demographic scale of the trial directly into the concluding sentence to maximize the final authority of the piece.
Ensuring the reader walks away fully grasping the real-world magnitude of the study.
Okay, so the actionable summary for the listener.
Right, the homework. Pull your strongest metric, the 71 to 72% efficacy, to the very front of your results sentence, and relegate the odds ratios to parentheses at the end. Insert a single explanatory clause, utilizing a word like seasonal or regional trend to explain that 0.277 control abundance spike, and rewrite that final conclusion to proudly feature the 700,000-plus population size and the viability for citywide suppression.
We want to warmly thank the listener for submitting such a rigorous, incredibly consequential piece of work. The underlying science here is poised to save lives, and, it is a privilege to read material of this caliber.
Truly.
We highly encourage you to implement these structural edits and submit your revised work back to the critique for further review. Remember, when you possess a mountain of flawless evidence, the goal isn't just to dump it all on the reader simultaneously. The goal is to build a highly structured, perfectly contextualized staircase out of that evidence and walk the reader right up to the truth.